This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Paul Bunyan, American myth or folklore, and I have two people who will talk about it. The subject is Paul Bunyan. Is it an American myth, or is it a bit of corporate folklore, or is it just regular folklore? Up in my left corner here, I have Diana Peterson. I've interviewed her before, but as I like to always do, I want to give my guests a few moments to introduce themselves. So Diana, you give a little bit of background about yourself and then some information specific as to what has drawn you to Paul Bunyan.
Yeah, I am currently the curator at the Chippewa Valley Museum in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Before that, for about 15 years, I was the executive director at what was the Paul Bunyan Logging Camp Museum, now known as the Wisconsin Logging Museum. And so I've always been interested in history. Carrie Ronander, director at the Chippewa Valley Museum, and I wrote a book about Wisconsin logging. And I've also written a child's book about Paul Bunyan. So Paul Bunyan's always been a favorite.
And James Leary is my other guest. If you could give a little bit of background about yourself, James, as well as anything you've written or involved with regarding Paul Bunyan.
Yeah, I'm an emeritus professor of folklore and Scandinavian studies at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I was born and raised in a small farming and logging town in northwest Wisconsin, Rice Lake, and grew up at a time when there were still a lot of old guys who had worked in lumber camps around. There was a resort owner who had a Paul Bunyan resort in my hometown, and the local bakery made Paul Bunyan bread. And when I was young, I also worked in the woods a little bit as a bark peeler. And I also watched Walt Disney on TV and saw the cartoon in the late 50s of Paul Bunyan, and was kind of excited that connected a little bit with my part of the country. And then later, from the 70s into the 90s, I did a fair amount of field work with people who had worked in the woods, including in lumber camps, as well as with contemporary loggers regarding some of their folklore and cultural traditions and occupational skills.
Well, just a couple of nights ago at my job, I work in retail. I had to go out back and take an axe to some wooden displays, and it took about 2.5 hours. So I had to sleep about 13 hours last night just to get back to it. But my dad was actually in the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, during the 1930s. And so he was out in the Oregon, Washington, Spokane, Idaho area there. And so he used to tell me some logging stories. But just to give you an idea, when I was a kid, I was born in 1965. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, in supermarkets, they would have sometimes where they would sell books or encyclopedias every month, a book for a month. And there was this company called Educator Classic Library that had about a dozen books over the course of a year. Everything from the Arabian Nights to the Virginian. And then this is, I still have it, my Paul Bunyan book. Paul Bunyan, Educated Classics. And this is a 50-year-old book, and illustrated by William Dempster, covered by Don Irwin. So this, it came with a lot of stuff, and on the sides here, you can see it had notes for children, to explain different terms. And this actually contains two of the more important Paul Bunyan pieces of mythos. The first is, I'll get it up here, a poem called The Round River Drive. Yeah. And then it famously has the Saginaw Paul Bunyan stories, which is probably, I guess, the Saginaw Paul Bunyan is probably to Paul Bunyan what Thomas Malory was to King Arthur in terms of setting the stage for a lot of the mythos there. So let me just throw this out to both of you, and whoever wants to chime in first can. Paul Bunyan, was this ever really a real myth, or was this maybe just in 1 or 2 logging camps and then expanded out? Or, what is the real story? Whichever one of you want to take it first.
Well, I can say folklorists would not call Paul Bunyan a myth for the most part. Myths for folklorists and anthropologists are these kind of sacred stories about deities who form elements of the earth as we know it, and one can say certainly some of the Bunyan stories move in that direction as developed by writers, but their roots are really in stories that were told in some lumber camps, certainly not in all, that had to do with a historical figure who was larger than life and did things that stretched credulity or sometimes really were obviously regarded as fictional.
Yeah. How about you, Diana? What is your take on that?
Yeah, I agree with Jim. From the research I've done, I think it's quite possible that Paul was based on maybe Fabian Fournier or Saginaw Joe. But I think this began in the lumber camps as, the average logger was 5 feet 4 inches, 140 pounds. And Saginaw Joe, what they talked about him was between 6 and 7 feet. So maybe they started talking about this lumberjack who was really strong and could do things. And as the stories moved, they developed a life of their own and became something not real. But I think it depends. Paul went through several evolutions. I think he started as a story that was told. And then I think when the Red River Lumber Company used him in their advertising, made him a national figure, embellished him, created new characters, it created a whole new Paul Bunyan. And then tourism created another Paul Bunyan that they used. And then I think Disney's version really made it popular with kids and kind of created the jovial, kind-hearted, strong, ingenuous Paul Bunyan that we all kind of think of.
What was the Disney version? When did that come out?
I'd have to check
58.
the exact dates, 58 or 59, somewhere in there.
So this wasn't a feature film, though, because it doesn't was it?
Yeah, 58. It
was it was an animated thing, of course.
is a cartoon.
Yeah, and it was a short. And Disney also made him a Pecos Bill and John Henry and other figures, and there was another illustrated book that Disney put out that I had as a kid, and then later I found a copy that I've got in my office at the university.
So let's talk about the root of the name, Paul Bunyan. I mean, before Paul Bunyan, what is his name? John Bunyan, who wrote the religious tract, is probably the most famous Bunyan. So was Paul Bunyan in any way a kind of religious figure, or was Paul Bunyan, what was the root of the name? Do we know?
There are different
Pilgrim's Progress. That's what John Bunyan.
Yeah, Pilgrim's Progress. But there are different theories. I mean, Bunyan is an English name, and there were actually people named Paul Bunyan if one does newspaper searches, and I even found one from 1901 in Bemidji, Minnesota, which has now been associated since the 30s with Bunyan, with a statue of Bunyan in the Blue Ox there. And it was one of those little things where Paul Bunyan has arrived in town from Minneapolis, but I haven't been able to find him in census records. There are some theories that Bunyan was French and the name was Bonjean, like good old John or something like that got anglicized into Bunyan. But and there are some theories that Bunyan was actually a figure in Canada, but researchers who have looked into that, Max Gartenberg and Edith Falk, for example, could not find any evidence of this figure. So I think we don't know. At least that's what I can figure out.
Diana, do you have any theories?
No, I've always heard the same thing, that the thing I run across more is maybe it's a combination when they first started the stories of this Saginaw Joe, and then like Jim mentioned, the Canadian from the Papineau Rebellion, which they called Paul Bunyan, but purely a guess on
So
no documentation.
I know in the book that I held up before, which contains most of the Saginaw Paul Bunyan stories. There are stories of Paul Bunyan dragging his axe behind him, creating the Grand Canyon. Stories of him up near the Bay of Fundy, and he somehow was responsible for that. There are stories based in Saginaw, as far down as New Orleans, over to British Columbia, back to Quebec and Newfoundland. So it seems that mythically speaking, or folklorically speaking, he was available everywhere. But do we know any? I mean, was this primarily, when you talk about the antecedents, was this primarily American or Canadian? Was it primarily in the Northeast, in the Saginaw, in the St. Lawrence Valley?
The best information we have is that the figure of Paul Bunyan emerged in the upper Midwest. The earliest instances and clear instances are in Wisconsin, maybe as early as 1885, right around that time in Minnesota, sometime maybe a little bit later in Michigan, but we don't know for sure, because Bunyan doesn't appear in a newspaper account until 1904 in Duluth, and other recollections of him had stories about him being told, say in the 1880s, were not really set down until the early 1920s or thereabouts, in correspondence with particularly someone like Charles Brown of the Wisconsin Historical Society, who was trying to search out about Bunyan. But in the 1920s, when Esther Shepherd, who was one of the two main popularizers of Bunyan in the 20s, Esther Shepherd and James Stevens did a bunch of work in the Pacific Northwest. They found that anyone who knew Bunyan stories actually came from the upper Midwest first, and people who researched Bunyan in Canada couldn't find any evidence of him emerging there, nor was there any early evidence of him emerging in New England. And so his appearance there, or his association with those places claiming to be, Bunyan's territory, began to crop up in the 20s and 30s, and as did a lot of these really sort of over the top and as you suggest, mythological kinds of stories about landscape formation by Bunyan. These were chiefly the inventions of writers. I mean, there were some early instances of a kind of tall tale saying, there are no trees in the Dakotas because Paul Bunyan logged off that area. And that's sort of like the main early landscape formation element that can be found with some credence in relation to oral tradition. But the other stuff is kind of made up by writers who are trying to capitalize on the figure of Bunyan and to just make him more grand. And a lot of this was happening in the context of American imperialism and militarism, and trying to establish itself on the world stage as a major power, and yet being a new country. Who are our own mighty mythological figures that can be pointed to, and so there was a certain amount of jingoism associated with Bunyan and from the 20s on.
Diana, let me ask you. Back in the mid 19th century, Wisconsin and Minnesota were considered the Northwest Territories. They weren't states. That was the extent of the U.S. But James had mentioned that the stories then spread westward towards the coast. Were these stories carried as the settlers got westward? Because I know you'd have first in 1849 the California Gold Rush, and 50 years later you had the Yukon Gold Rush, and I know that there are stories of Paul Bunyan further out there. Did he move west along with the settlers?
I think, well, I agree with Jim. I'm biased, but I think Wisconsin has the best claim to Paul Bunyan. I know Bangor, Maine claims to be the birthplace of Paul, but like he said, that when Charles Brown talked to the loggers and that worked in 1885 to 90, they told a lot of stories that they had heard in the camps. And I think, so Red River Lumber, that really popularized him from 1914 to 44, they started in Ackley, Minnesota, but then moved to Westwood, California. So I think a lot of the Paul Bunyan stories got transported with them, but I'm sure the loggers, as they moved across the country, also took some form of the Paul Bunyan story. You do hear stories in Portland. They talk about how he formed, I think it's Puget Sound, and then there's the mountain out there. Even the Texas and Oklahoma oil fields claim Paul. They have tall tales about Paul in the oil industry down there. So I think he moved across the country, just as Jim said, as it became more popular culture. And I think Red River had a lot to do with him moving to California.
Before we start talking about, I'm sorry, go.
I'll just add it. I think it's important to say that many of the early tales associated with Bunyan were not specific to Bunyan. You know, there were stories, exaggerated stories that could be told about someone else or an old lumberjack or something like that, and there were many people who worked in the woods who had never heard of Paul Bunyan. You know, I lived just down the road from an old guy who had worked in lumber camps in the around 1900, and he'd never heard of Paul Bunyan. There was a famous Wisconsin timber cruiser named John Nelligan who put together Reminiscence, the Life of a Lumberjack, that the Wisconsin Historical Society published. And when they turned it into a book, there was a writer from Washburn, Wisconsin, named Chip Sheridan, who said, well, where are the Paul Bunyan stories? And Nelligan said, well, I never heard any, but Sheridan actually added a bunch of them because, you know, that was what the public was looking for. And so one of the things that I think happened in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere, also in the upper Midwest, where people hadn't, in many cases, heard Bunyan stories, even if they had worked in the woods, was by the 1920s, there was a larger public consciousness of the Bunyan figure, thanks to the publicity, as Diana said, of W.B. Lawfed's Red River Lumber Camp and his publishing the adventures of Paul Bunyan. And so they began to kind of just take on the Bunyan figure and attributes other stories to Bunyan and engage in further exaggeration and sort of play up the part. And one thing that was going on, particularly in the upper Midwest in the 1920s, was that the era of the lumber camps had played out. My hometown, Rice Lake, that was a logging and farming and you know, a mill town, was having to change economically, and there were efforts to build a Northwoods tourist industry. And as you're doing that, you can create these romantic attractions. And so this timber cruiser, Paul Fournier in my hometown, who was retired, created the Paul Bunyan Resort, and up in Hayward, Tony Wise created this, logger sports and logging sort of complex. And then you began to have these Paul Bunyan lumber camp, all you can eat breakfast sorts of things sprouting up. And so part of the proliferation of Bunyan had to do not so much with people taking grassroots stories they'd heard in one locale and going to another, but rather wherever they were, buying into what was a trend or a movement or something like that was mostly promulgated through kind of pop culture and emergent mass media.
Let me touch on a few things, and then when we'll take a break and we'll get back, we'll talk more about the actual stories themselves. But I want to just get a little bit more of the background, and there are 4 elements. I'll start with the first two. The 2 characters that are most often compared to Paul Bunyan are Pecos Bill and John Henry. And of the 3 of them, it seems John Henry, the steel driving man, the ex-slave, has a little bit of basis in Black people who actually did that work until you get to the far west, and the Chinese were the main railroad builders. Let me start, and I'll start with you, Diana. What links are there between Pecos Bill and Paul Bunyan in terms of them being just purely made up characters versus someone like a John Henry who seems to be a little bit more based in reality? Diana?
Well, I think Jim would probably be a better with Pecos Bill. I know a little bit of the stories, but apart from him kind of having this larger than life personality and popular culture hero, Jim probably knows a lot more than I do.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the writer who created Pecos Bill, but he was totally the invention of a writer trying to create local color in the American Southwest. And there was no Pecos Bill figure in actual on the ground, face to face, culturally based folklore. But there were there's a recent look at John Henry. There was someone in the convict release program who worked on the Big Bend Tunnel in West Virginia. An African American steel driver, and so there are elements of verisimilitude or grounding in reality in the John Henry story, and the pitting of labor against machines, and also the John Henry figure has been important to African Americans. Back in the late 70s, I taught at the University of Kentucky, and occasionally went down to Berea College for our Appalachia days. And there were a couple of old African American musicians, Homer Walker and another fellow who I don't recall, one of whom had grown up not far from the site of the Big Bend Tunnel, and he did the John Henry song and had certainly memories of that. So John Henry is truly an authentic folk figure, although he's obviously gotten bound up like Bunyan with all sorts of other representations and uses and developments and so forth. But in contrast, Pecosville is completely something from the imagination of a local color writer looking to promote a region.
So to just give a modern perspective, Pecos Bill is more akin to something like the modern Slender Man, where we know who created, Slender, the Slender Man mythos? Yeah, he's more of a modern Slender Man. John Henry is more of real folklore, and Bunyan is somewhere between the two.
Yeah, kind of, but I think Pecos Bill never really took off or resonated with people in the way that Slender Man did, where you have people committing horrible acts, based on control by the figure, or other people kind of taking on the figure through the internet and developing additional permutations thereof. I think Pecos Bill really, like I say, didn't capture the imagination and create new manifestations like Slender Man has.
Diana, how about Babe the Blue Ox? Where did that figure come from, and why blue?
From the best of my research, I think that William Lawford, who we talked about with this Red River Lumber, he created this whole advertising campaign beginning in 1914 with Paul Bunyan. The first one didn't really take off, and then he published another one, and then it got very popular. But he created Johnny Inkslinger, the clerk. He created Sourdough Sam, the cook. And I believe, although there's a lot of stories about how Paul found Babe, from my research, it seemed like he also came up with Babe, the figure of Babe. Jim, is that what you've seen too?
I think there's evidence earlier of Bunyan having an ox in the blue snow, but I think the name Babe wasn't, it didn't have a specific name. And I will say that oxen, of course, were used in lumber camps to skid timbers until later on, when with icing, forming ruts in roads and icing them and so forth, then you could make it easier to transport sleds of logs drawn by teams of horses. But the oxen were the most commonly used in the first several decades of logging, and certainly in the late 19th century. And blue snow, I mean, I think that's also an emphasis on bitter coldness, exaggerated coldness, that makes you turn blue, and the ox had turned blue from the bitter cold. I think that sort of thing is going on.
So I wanted to, before we take a break, I wanted to ask about a person who isn't really thought of in the Paul Bunyan mythos, but who wrote some books that I think are similar. And I'm talking about a poet named John G. Nyhart, who did The Cycle of the West, The Song of Hugh Glass, which was the basis for that Leonardo DiCaprio film. He did Black Elk Speaks. And he did a lot of these poems that mythologize real people like a Hugh Glass or some Native Americans. And it seems to me that from the closing of the West in 1890 till about, I guess you could say, at the Great Depression, there's a 30 or 40-year window where the popularizing of the Old West, of rural Americana, especially out West, takes hold. And it seems to me that someone like Nyhart, in his poetry of real people, was doing some of the same things that a lot of the people who wrote about Paul Bunyan in various tales and poems and whatnot were doing with his mythic character. Let me start with you, James. Do you find anything of what I've just said? Is there a correlation between these real life people that people like Nyhart and others were writing about and the Paul Bunyan growth of a mythos?
Well, I think as you say, as both the the old west of the trail drives and the frontier era, and the days of the large lumber camps were fading. There was this impulse by a lot of people, and certainly including creative writers, to capture certain essences of that lost world and create dramatic stories or epic poems out of them, and also, American literature, American writers in many cases, certainly in the 19th and early 20th century, were often trying to look to American materials and American models in the same way that early on Washington Irving looked to legends in New York State rather than in Europe to create Rip Van Winkle and also
Ichabod Crane.
What's the one?
Ichabod Crane.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, Ichabod Crane. Yes, the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So I think what you say is exactly right. And one even earlier on, you mentioned the Virginian, and certainly Owen Wister had spent time in Montana, and it's a great novel.
Oh yeah.
And in it, there are elements of tall tales and
well, we don't know the name of the main character in that book.
Yeah, and so I think he's drawing on doses of reality, but also, and I guess that reality also includes the inclination to exaggerate and tell stories, and then he's taking those and shaping them into a dramatic narrative, pitting the Virginian against Trampas and having other little dramatic elements in there. And so yeah, I think writers are drawing on these kinds of materials. There isn't quite a novel of the stature of Wister that has to do with the lumber camps, although Edna Ferber's Come and Get It is pretty interesting. It focuses though more on a kind of a lumber baron and also a kind of a powerful but not too bright Scandinavian logger as his sidekick. But I think what you're saying is exactly right about this desire of writers to seize on elements of not only the gritty reality, but the fading nature of the Old West or the lumber camps, and also invest it with some of this larger than life drama and exaggeration and color.
Diana, any comments about Bunyan and maybe his role in? Was he ever associated with Manifest Destiny as these tales moved westward?
Well, I agree with Jim. I think authors try to capture, I think we see this as a classic story, whether you're talking about explorers or the Wild West, the lumber camps, times of war, where you have these groups of people that are thrown together that are very different, that are together 24/7. And you have a lot of personalities, you have a lot of conflict, but you have a lot of comradeship. And I think they're all, I think the lumber camps can be seen in MASH, on TV. It's another form of these people that are put together, not by choice, and literally living together apart from other people. So I think that's a classic story, and most of us don't experience that. And I think it's also the kind of symbol of American strength, right, and endurance and ingenuity. And at least in Paul Bunyan, as bigger than life, I think he symbolizes America to a lot of people, doing the impossible, having the strength to persevere.
I think it's also worth pointing out, since you bring up something like Manifest Destiny, Dan, that there are these kind of political and economic and imperialist implications to Bunyan, and there are some revisionist approaches to the Bunyan figure that counter some of the more virtuous attributions that Diana just mentioned. For example, there are a number of recent treatments, like 21st century treatments, that show Bunyan as being regretful about the the defoliation and the massive clear cutting, and so that he's repentant, and maybe he's planting trees now or in his old age. And then there are also in Minnesota, among the some of the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe folks, they've regarded Bunyan as this threat to the traditional way of life, and there are some representations where he's opposed by their kind of trickster and culture hero Winnebago, who is trying to defend the living creatures, the animals and the trees and stuff, from this this white guy who's coming through and slashing and everything and destroying habitat, and also clearing the way for cultural genocide against indigenous people. So there is this kind of dark side that, like I say, there are revisionist treatments or counter treatments that are less, I think, less well known by the general public, but they're definitely there.
The one, even though he's not associated, the one painter that I always think of when if I think of Paul Bunyan and painting is Albert Bierstadt, who painted these huge canvases of the natural splendor of America or whatnot. But so I early on had mentioned that the book that I held up had the Saginaw Paul Bunyan tales and so forth, and I want to just deal with a bit of the publishing history. But what was the first book or the first story published? Do we know? Do we have a beginning point? And is it just something heard from the logging camps, or is there a definitive author, as there was in Pecos Bill? Let me start with you, Diana, if you know.
So as far as I know, so James McGilvery gets credit a lot. He published a story in Detroit in 1910, but the first time the stories were documented, as far as I know, was Jim had talked about Charles Brown from the Historical Society here, and he recorded stories that lumberjacks had told in Tomahawk, Wisconsin. And then there was a write-up in 1904, as Jim said, in the Duluth Evening News. And then there was a further publication in Milwaukee in 1910 from Alder's book, which had a compilation. And then in 1916, Bernice Stewart and Homer Watt, she was a student, he was her professor from Wisconsin, from Madison, traveled around recording specifically the Paul Bunyan stories. And then they shared them in a publication in 1916 in the Wisconsin Academy of Art, Sciences, and Letters. So as far as I know, that was the kind of beginning. Those were the first publications. And then in the 20s, James Stevens published his book. And I know Jim mentioned someone else named Esther, whose book I had not seen.
Esther Shepherd.
Yeah, and if I remember right, it's been quite a while since I saw the Stevens book. But if I remember, there were some very also disturbing stories in there, kind of racist, kind of crude things that we don't think of in the Paul Bunyan story anymore, but not always pleasant stories. And then along with that, 1925, you had William Lawford publishing these publications from 1914 to 1944, which was a very different version of Paul Bunyan. Those were the first, and now there's more than 300 books out there.
Yeah, the best chronicling of the Bunyan stories is a book by Michael Edmonds called Out of the North Woods, and it really is superb, not only in chronicling much of what Diana mentioned, but also it includes the texts of over 100 early Bunyan stories. Now, one thing I'll add to this, Diana mentioned Rockwell's publication in the Outers in Milwaukee in 1910, and then this earlier 1904 Duluth Herald. And new material comes online all the time on newspaper search engines. And so in preparing for this session today, I did some more newspaper searching, and I actually found a three-part series without an attributed author in 1908, February and March 1908, published in the Duluth Herald. And it's a kind of a frame story in a boarding house. There's an old timer and some youngsters who are they're all been working in the woods. They ask him about certain things, and he holds forth and tells all of these Bunyan stories. And as I say, it's serialized in this three-part series. And it has a number of the classic stories that later, 2 years later, Rockwell published, and some overlap with McGillivray's stuff. So I think there still are mysteries out there to pursue.
I mentioned in the book two well-known kind of tales. The Round River Drive, I have a version that's a poem, but just looking online, I think you had mentioned S.E. Schlosser was someone who wrote a book called The Round River Drive. Is that a well-known tale? Because I can just read the first few lines from the poem here, but it doesn't have an author. It's The Round River Drive starts off, "'Twas 64 or 65, we drove the great Round River Drive. 'Twas 65 or 64, yes, it was during of the war, or it was after, or it before. They were the days in Michigan, the good old days when any man." And so it goes on about that drive. But is the Round River Drive one of the stories that was one of the earliest tales of Paul Bunyan? Go ahead.
It was. I will tell you that's not one of my favorite, but it is. And I don't remember the exact story, but somehow they get in this round river and they keep going around and around and get stuck. Sometimes they call it, like you said, the Onion. What do they call it? The Onion River Drive. Sometimes it's a round river.
Yeah, and of course, maybe everyone knows this, but white pine floats quite well as opposed to red pine or other kinds of timber. And a lot of the early logging in the upper Midwest was with white pine, and in the spring of the year when the rivers were swollen with snow melt, you could float the lengths of white pine down the river, and sometimes it gets snagged and so forth, but there would be a driving crew trying to guide the logs so they could get eventually down to a mill. And as Diana said, in this case, they seem to never get to the mill, and they notice the same landmarks over and over again, and they realize they're going around in a circle. And this was one of it was like a prose, let us say, story that McGillivray set down. And then there was a former logger named Douglas Mallock who called himself the lumberjack poet. And soon after McGillivray's account of the Round River Drive, which can be found in other sources as well, Malik authored this poem, and it became quite popular. And there was also a fellow named Eugene Shepard, who was a former timber cruiser and a promoter from Rhinelander, Wisconsin, who is associated with this legendary beast of the lumber camps, the hodag, and he claimed authorship as well of the Round River Drive, which was it was a totally false claim, but that was one of the stories that likely did circulate in oral tradition, but then was transformed, especially through Malik's poem.
So I mentioned the Saginaw Paul Bunyan, and aside from the book that I had shown you, I do have a later edition by James Stevens, and I was just comparing the online edition of that with it, and it seems that some tales come, some tales go. I early had mentioned that seems to be sort of the Bunyan version of Thomas Mallory's collection of King Arthur mythos and Camelot. One, do you think that's an apt comparison? And two, is it thought of as sort of the definitive tales of Paul Bunyan, even if a few of them are not in certain editions and some others are? Diana, you want to take that?
I think Stevens, I don't know if he just did a compilation or if he actually made some of them up, but that book was really written for adults. I think we think of Paul Bunyan as a child's tale more, but I think that's the Disney influence, and because so many of the books since have been written for kids. But I believe Stevens' book was written for adults, not children. And so the stories are just a little different than, like I said, some of them were a little more racist, some of them were a little more crude. He talked about the big mosquitoes being a nuisance, and not as much the fun, like the creation of the Grand Canyon. But it's been, like I said, it's been a long time since I've seen that book. Jim, do you remember any more on that one? How?
Yeah, Stevens claimed to have gotten these stories from oral tradition, and he mentions working loggers, as sources, but never connects particular stories with particular people. And his work has been looked at by by different researchers and critics, and their conclusion has generally been that some of the stories are from oral tradition, and others are probably his invention. And of course, they're also in his style. And as Diana said, there's a lot that is indicative of rustic male crudeness, as well as racism in the stories, particularly in early published accounts. In like this 1908 one that I mentioned, the N-word is used for these two so-called boys who grease Bunyan's giant pancake griddle by slapping hams to their feet. And
I think that's in my book here. I think that I remember that tale.
Yeah, and so some of that stuff was common, although Stevens, and this partly has to do with censorship at the time, certainly didn't publish any obscene or raunchy stories. And back in 1991, I did a book called So Oli Says to Lena, Folk Humor of the Upper Midwest, and it has jokes and humorous anecdotes from oral tradition from the Upper Midwest, a lot of which I recorded, but others were recorded by other people. And just to give you one example, this old lumberjack that was born in 1885, who was my neighbor when I was growing up. In 1975, I sat down with him with a tape recorder, and we drank some brandy and 7-Up, his version of the old fashioned, I guess. And he he told me a lot of stories from the lumber camps. And one, he was actually a timber scaler, and so his job was he had a kind of a like a yardstick and a table so that he could calculate the number of board feet in a given log. And he worked for the Rainy Lake Lumber Company in northern Minnesota. And he said in one place there was a popular sporting house, a whorehouse, and there was a young school teacher who had come, a guy who had come to that community, and he ended up falling in love with a young woman who he thought was a lovely virginal young woman, but she actually had been a kind of a regular in the sporting house. And so on their wedding night, which was in the upper story of the local hotel, the lumberjacks took a ladder, and one climbed to the top and was sort of doing a play-by-play, he's whispering down to the next guy on the rung, oh, now they're getting into bed, and this sort of thing. And then the woman says to her new husband, "You're putting it where no man ever put it before." And the guy on the top says, "He's putting it in her asshole." So, that's a lumberjack, at least one of the lumberjack stories. And, you're not going to get Walt Disney taking that on, or even James Stevens publishing that in 1925. And Bunyan, there, in addition to invention, there has been a cleaning up of lumberjack stories, or ideas of lumberjack stories. First, for a mainstream adult audience, but then eventually Bunyan, especially since the 1950s, but likely before, has been the stuff of children's stories. And so it's kind of sentimental and kindly and silly and exaggerated, and it has a little bit of verisimilitude in relation to just a bunch of men cutting trees and having big appetites and performing mighty feats. But it also is very much cleaned up for contemporary audiences.
Well, cleaned up in terms of the sex, but as you mentioned, I mean, you just look at like Sam Clemens, Mark Twain. I mean, he had, pardon my French, Nigger Jim and Injun Joe, and so this is the way it was. So I mean, they might clean it up for the sex stuff, but there was still going to be the stuff. But I mean, even in the book I have, which came out in '69 or '70, I guess, at least this edition, the ethnicities of the certain lumberjacks, whether it's the cook or the guy who's leading the drive down the river or whatnot, they're all there's the Frenchman, the Swede, the Finn, the this, that. That was part of each character's makeup.
Yeah, and of course the camps were mixed. There was, in the Upper Midwest, there was a strong element of Northern New England Yankees and Anglo-Canadians who'd been working in the Canadian Maritimes, French Canadians. There were a lot of Irish, particularly Irish, who had come into the Upper Midwest by way of Canada. The old timer that I mentioned, who was born in 1885, George Russell, his father had also worked in lumber camps in the Chippewa Valley, and they had come into Canada and down through Ontario into northern Wisconsin. But then there were lots of Germans in the lumber camps. There were Norwegians. There were Swedes. There were Finns. There were Belgians. Later on in the UP, I talked to old timers.
And UP means Upper Peninsula of Michigan, for people.
Yeah, that's right. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I talked to people who were in camps with Croatians and Russians and Italians who this would have been in the early decades of the 20th century. So there was quite a mixture in these camps, and as you say, I mean, there's certainly been evidence in representations of Bunyan and other lumber camp settings since at least the 1920s.
And I once worked with a Michigander who was a Youper, and made sure to know that he was from the UP. That's what they call them, Youpers.
Say yeah to the UP,
Yeah. So I want to just end this segment. I want to read off the 13 tales in my book's version here. Some are different from the Stevens version. I don't know who actually wrote them, but they are. I found most of these tales repeated ad nauseum in assorted Bunyan collections. Just if any of them ring a bell with either of you or have any kind of input, let me just read the titles, and stop me if one stands out. So the first one is The Outpost of the Saginaw. Second one is Taming of the Big Auger. I think that's one that's very well repeated. The Round River Crossing, which is different than the poem version. Snooze Mountain. No. The Trotting Trees, that's another one I've seen a lot of. Does that ring a bell? The Trotting Trees? No. The Hunting of the Mince. Okay. The Spring of the Mud Rain. Okay, well, maybe it's not as widespread as I thought. Why the Great Lakes Have No Whales. No. Little Frayed and Big Skeery.
Yeah, that's a well-known international folktale that's quite old.
So that's one of the older Bunyan tales?
Well, it's not an older, it's an older tale period that predates Bunyan and isn't exclusive to Bunyan. So
like a lot of in the way, say, Hans Christian Andersen would have borrowed from the Brothers Grimm. Okay. Iron Man of the Saginaw. This is another one that the Bully Bees. I've seen that in a lot of the Bully Bees. No, the Colossal Cornstalk. I would think that might have something to do with Jack. And then the Year of the Good Old Times. So I guess maybe the individual tales are not as well known as I might have thought. So let's then talk about some of the stuff in the last 50 years or so. I had done a show rather, about, and I don't think, no, I don't, were you on it when I did the Bigfoot show, Diana? You weren't on my Bigfoot show, were you? No, so Bigfoot is a good example. I had mentioned Slender Man. Bigfoot is a good example of something that apparently had been around, but not really mythically embedded in the culture. And then it took off 50-some years ago in the late 60s when the supposed film was taken of a Bigfoot. Has Paul Bunyan in the last 50 or so years since this book that I got as a child, has basically it waned? I mean, it doesn't seem like Paul Bunyan has a lot of staying power. Is it sort of on its last legs? No? Go ahead, Diana.
No, I think Paul Bunyan's maybe even gotten more popular. You know,
really?
Matt Rice right now, the documentarian, is working on a documentary. I've seen a lot of books come out about logging camps on Paul Bunyan lately. You know, some of the stories that you talked about that were older have maybe been replaced as we're leaning more towards kids now. You know, we kind of hear the more fun things like one day Paul was bringing in groceries and they had keys coming in for the whole season, which tipped into the lake. And so he lit a fire around the lake and they cooked it and turned it into pea soup so they could eat. Or one time he put a blue tarp down to look like a lake when they were out of food, and all these ducks came and sat on it, and he was able to get the ducks, roll them up in what they thought was the lake and take them to the cook. You know, they talked about it was so cold that the men's words actually froze. And then when spring came, all these conversations were happening, although nobody was talking at all because the words unfroze. More fun kind of things like that. And you talked about the Great Lakes, and they say that he had to create these bath areas for Babe, and those are the Great Lakes. Or he fell walking across New York, and where his hand landed turned into the Finger Lakes, things like that, more fun geographical things. But I think Paul Bunyan, I've just seen it in a lot of curricula, a lot of different things. When we did our Paul Bunyan book, we included some of those well-known stories, but we made up two of our own. And I think that's part of the charm of Paul Bunyan, is you can continue to create these tall tales of more about your area or things that come up. So there's still new things to create with him.
I do remember the frozen words thing. I think that might be in my book, because I remember that from a child. James, what is your take on the health, if you will, of Paul Bunyan folklore?
Well, first I'll add that there are, of course, raunchier versions of the frozen words. The heavy diet of beans and prunes in the lumber camps caused flatulence, and there are also stories about frozen gases suddenly freshening the air in the spring.
Well, I'm sure Babe probably had a lot of gas himself.
Yeah. So that's a
hurricane's worth.
Methane, global warming going on with it.
Yeah, let's blame it on Babe.
Yeah. But just to add to Diana's point, there are lots of communities that have vested interests in Paul Bunyan. There are Paul Bunyan camps, there are Paul Bunyan restaurants, there are Paul Bunyan resorts, there are Paul Bunyan statues, there are Paul Bunyan days, there are all sorts of communities that are trying to promote the romance of the forest and that sort of thing. And so in those communities, Bunyan is something that people do want to sustain in one way or another. And I'll say myself, while I have kind of mixed feelings about Bunyan as a figure, as someone who, I was born in 1950, and at the time there were still lots of old timers who had worked in big camps, and they used to hang out at the library. The old Carnegie Library corner had some benches in Rice Lake, and a lot of them would wear their wool and long underwear, 365 days of the year. And there was a museum bar in town called the Buckhorn Tavern that had a lot of logging artifacts, and I was really excited to know some of these people as a kid, and then excited when the Disney thing came out. And then I was really excited to swing an axe and wield a saw, and I cut fire lines, and I peeled popple bolts and for the Excelsior mill in the 60s. And I was proud of that. And later, my son, who's a forestry engineer for the Forest Service in Libby, Montana, was a working logger in the school forest at Oregon State University, where he learned to fell and to set chokers and to buck and to load. And he also put on spurs and a belt and climbed with a chainsaw dangling, a small one, from his tool belt to climb big spar trees and limb them so that they could do some rigging to when they're hauling logs, winching them up steep hillsides, they could kind of clear things with the block and tackles set up on a large spar tree. And so, you know, there's my son who kind of enjoys this Bunyan stuff, and my daughter is often on the lookout for goofy old historical postcards, and now and then she'll find me one in a cave of Paul Bunyan's toadstool, or you know, some other kind of place. And so I think there are these you know, they're nerdy people like me, I think, who you know, have an interest in the figure in a kind of a historical but also a playful sort of a way. And that's, in my case, extends to my kids.
So let's.
Well, you can take up the sport of axe throwing now too.
Yeah, lumberjack sports are, you know, burling or log rolling. I mean, that's kind of taken off in a way. I mean, when I was a kid in the 50s and early 60s, they did have the Wide World of Sports. They would have the lumberjack competitions in Hayward, and there are several colleges that have forestry programs, and they also have you know, lumberjack sports teams that ties into some of this. And there are I know well, the pandemic has kind of cut into this, but in Green Bay and various other places, the Timber Producers Association of Wisconsin and Michigan would have lumberjack competitions that would have chopping and climbing and crosscut saw use and speed and precision competitions with chainsaws. Sometimes the chainsaws are fitted out like drag racing cars, where they have like motorcycle engines on them, and they run on alcohol, so they'll only run for about 20 seconds, but at a high rate of speed and power, so you can slice through these cants of timber. So, you know, a lot of that plays into since we still are using wood, and wood has become more sustainable in our contemporary era, and all that does tie into or relies on, in some ways, a figure like Bunyan.
Well, a lot of strongman competitions also have a lot of logging kind of stuff, lifting big logs and whatnot. So I want to end by looking forward, not backward, with Paul Bunyan and mythos in general. Do you think that is there anything now in the modern day that's equivalent to a Paul Bunyan, or is everything online? I mean, I mentioned Slender Man, but Slender Man is more akin to, you know, the Bigfoots or the Chupacabras, you know, that kind of thing. Is there a modern equivalent of a Paul Bunyan in terms of a person who's done something that's going to be recalled, or sports figures, or let me start with you, Jim.
Oh man, I can't think of anyone right off the top of my head on the scale of Bunyan. I will say I over the years I've done a lot of field research with different kind of male and nowadays also women involved in working class trades involving agility and strength and skill, particularly recently with iron workers who are the raising gangs for structural steel for buildings and bridges as well. And even though OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, has put in all kinds of safety requirements where people are, you know, tied off in harnesses and one thing or another, there still is a lot of pride and skill and prowess, in their prowess and their ability to, climb girders and do things with speed and competence. And there are stories told about old timers, and some of those people in particular stand out. So the iron workers that I worked with, and along with one of my friends, Bucky Halker, who worked with iron workers in Chicago, they did have cycles of stories about actual old timers with whom they worked, and there were lots of little anecdotes told about their feats of strength or quirky things that they would do, or accidents, near misses, the pranks, those kinds of things. So I think the impulse that created Bunyan, emerging out of work groups doing demanding kinds of work, is fundamentally a human phenomenon, and does persist. But I can't, as I said, think of a particular figure nowadays who is a worker who has come close to the status of Bunyan.
Diana, any comments on that?
The closest I can think of are kind of the superheroes, Batman, Superman, that have been around for 70 some years now. You look at the mild-mannered Clark Kent, who had different abilities, or Batman has gone through all these different incarnations. You have the really dark Batman, the campy Batman. Those are humans, but have some superhuman powers. And I guess you could kind of say Paul was somewhat human, but with superhuman powers because of his size. And that's the closest thing I can think of to a current Paul Bunyan legend.
Well, let's look to the future, because Bunyan was certainly a frontier character, a frontier, and if we look outward, the only place really humanity has to go now is outer space. The last frontier from when I was a child, and the moon. I mean, 50 plus years since Neil Armstrong, and anyone back in 1971 or 72 would have bet we'd have a colony on the moon by now. The only one who's even talking about, say, going to Mars is Elon Musk, and I have a lot of problems with him. But he seems to have the necessary braggadocio that I could imagine if Mars colony gets started and he's involved in it, him becoming this kind of mythic kind of figure. Just even if he's just funding it, he'd somehow balloon himself into it. Does someone like a Musk fit the tale of this kind of character, or would it have to be the actual people who are settling Mars and doing the hard physical labor? Say, are they the more mythic types? What would you say, Jim?
I think that Musk or Jeff Bezos could maybe hire a team of writers and PR people to put this one over, but I think most people would think of them as billionaire, egotistical, doofuses, and you'd be more likely to have derogatory stories. But because a figure like Bunyan is sort of not even a rags to riches person, but a person who stays on kind of the common person's level, yet rises to extraordinary heights, getting their hands dirty rather than using their brain and their wits to amass large amounts of money and then hire people to create things. So I don't see a person like Musk or Bezos getting to this stature, but certainly I can imagine someone who is an extraordinary spaceship pilot or something like that, arising like this. And certainly science fiction writers have been imagining such figures for a while.
And that would seem to be the essence of Fakelore, someone like a Bezos or a Musk self-aggrandizing. Diana, what are your thoughts on any future Bunyan-like figures in outer space or somewhere else, perhaps?
Yeah, no, I agree. I could see it, some of the interplanetary explorers becoming kind of Paul Bunyan, the things that they find there that we're not as familiar with that become these stories, or even you look at undersea. I mean, there's so much we don't know. So undersea explorers, as we start to use more of it and they explore this new territory, I could see them becoming a kind of underwater Paul Bunyan.
Or like
Jim said, they're on the front end, they're working hard with everybody. They're not overseeing or standing back. They're just part of the group using and trying to make life better for the people that they're with.
Yeah, I was thinking terraforming of Mars. I mean, a lot of the stories, that are made up about Paul Bunyan, he's basically doing terraforming, making the Great Lakes or the Finger Lakes or the Grand Canyon or, the Bay of Fundy anyway. So anyway, Diana, any final thoughts then as we head out? Are there any particular books other than your own, although you can plug your own, that people should read as the essential guide to Paul Bunyan?
Yeah, well, I will say my favorite books, and this is more related to kids. There's a Rabbit Ears Paul Bunyan book by Brian Gleason. There's Winter of the Blue Snow by Andy Gregg, but it's very hard to get. I think it's pretty pricey now. I think you have to go into Rare Books. And then Steve Kellogg had a really great book. That's why we actually wrote our book, because we used the Brian Gleason and the Steve Kellogg book where I worked in our gift shop, and they went out of print, and even the authors were not allowed to reprint them. So we had a hard time finding a book like that. So those three, I think, are really fun. And if you're an adult or you want more of the history, like Jim said, Michael Edmonds' book is just fantastic.
And I'll link to both of your books below this video. James, if you could, other than your own book, if you want to plug your book, someone else other book that people might want to look into regarding Paul Bunyan.
Yeah, again, I'll give a shout out to Michael Edmonds, Out of the North Woods. It really is superb. There was there are two other earlier classic works. One is American Folklore by Richard Dorson, published in 1959 originally, and he has a chapter in it that looks at the Bunyan figure, looking at Lawfed and also looking at the so-called Fakelore, the faking of some stories as if they were authentic folklore. And then there was a book by Daniel G. Hoffman called Paul Bunyan, the Last of the Frontier Demigods, that's very good. Also published, I think, in the 50s. And I'll add just my book, Solely Sistolina, Folk Humor of the Upper Midwest, has a section on lumber camp stories that were actually drawn from recordings from working loggers, and not only from the early 20th century, but extending all the way up into the 1990s, involving loggers in the Upper Midwest region.
And do those books that you mentioned, do they sort of look at them the way we would look at the tales of King Arthur or the Greek gods, and break them apart, or is it more sociological?
Well, what I try to do in my book on humor is look at the relationship between region and occupation and landscape and ethnic diversity, and how humorous stories emerge out of the interactions of people in the Upper Midwest, or how stories that have come from other places, from earlier eras, have been adapted to fit, and how those stories really deal with concerns or curiosities or thoughts that that people have that interest and compel them in their everyday lives. So that's kind of the larger perspective, but I also provide biographies of the storytellers and photographs of them, so readers can, and transcriptions of the words of the people themselves, so that people can also kind of draw their own conclusion from so-called primary materials.
Well, I want to thank both you and Diana for spending up an hour and a half or so speaking of Paul Bunyan.